It's not often I get to share a stage with John Lennon there. I mean, John Scott, James Scott. Well, yeah, I'm up here about to speak a little bit about the Declaration of Arbroath and its provenance and stuff. But I'm actually going to have to run away back down, or away down to the enemy. Down, well, we should say, well, Westminster's more the enemy. The people of England are certainly our friends. But I'm going to have to go down there, because every time they want some decent engineering done, they always phone a Scotsman. So that's where I'll be off to later on today, way down to Leicester, to do some proper Scottish engineering all week. But let's get back on subject again. Declaration of Arbroath. I'm going to talk about provenance, because it's really important to speak about the provenance behind the Declaration of Arbroath, because there's many good people at Salvo right now beginning to really put the claim of right front and centre to everything that we're thinking about just now, and relighting the flame of the independence movement behind that. And one of the ways we can do that is start to talk about the provenance behind the Declaration of Arbroath. We all know it was signed in 1320, and it was such an auspicious letter sent to the powers that be back then. And you know, as they go into the Declaration of Arbroath and more the claim of right, they talk about these sectarian words within the claim of right. But see, when you put that in the context of the day, they were talking about no superpower, no power from far overseas would ever rule over Scotland, no matter how big it was. And they were talking about the Vatican City back then, because that was more like the United Nations. It was more like the European Union taking over and pushing Scots out of Scotland and taking up the sovereignty of Scotland as their own. Now, the sovereignty of Scotland, who do we know right now that has taken that sovereignty on and taken it as their own? That might be Westminster. The sovereignty of Scots was first written down in the Declaration of Arbroath, because laws were beginning to be passed at that point in time. You know, we had things like being able to have free and equal legal representation in the 1100s, and the run up to, it was like the 1190, and the run up to the Declaration of Arbroath. These laws were beginning to get written down, and it was becoming more important in a world stage to have a declaration of Scottish sovereignty and our constitution written down, so that it could never be denied to the Scots. And we have the essence of what it would take within the Declaration of Arbroath to have that sovereignty taken from the people of Scotland, and that's genocide. That's what it comes down to. This is one of the reasons that they tried to commit genocide against the Scots. This is one of the reasons we're so bloody well downhodden, as the book would tell us right now, or maybe downtrodden, because there were lots of very forthright Scots back in 1707. They rioted in Edinburgh, they rioted in Glasgow, and many other towns and cities around Scotland. They rioted. There were famines when the people of Scotland were told that if you want to eat, you're going to have to subdue your neighbour by joining the garrisons. It's either that, or you're going to die of starvation, or you're going to have a boat deported, or you're just going to have your head, you're just going to be executed, plain executed. The genocide happened in the run-up to the run-up to the treaty that we're all held under right now. That genocide happened in the run-up to that, and it happened after that. And it's taken 300 years to recover the gallousness of Scots. It's taken 300 years to recover and find our backbone again. But because of the work of Salvo and finding the Declaration of Arbroath, and that feeds into our sovereignty and the claim of right, and because that all feeds into that, that's why we're finding our backbone again. It's down to Salvo and people power. And this is why the tide is rising, and there's going to be such a huge turnout of the marches this year. People are beginning to believe again. So that's where we are. Now, the Declaration of Arbroath It's what we're here to celebrate today. And that provenance comes from the oral tradition. Oral tradition goes back to even African societies, and it's handed down generation by generation. A lot of us will remember going to people's houses and celebrating the turning of the year, Old Year's Night and all that kind of thing, and people would do a turn. That turn came from the oral tradition. Everyone had something to say, a poem to read, a song to sing, and a lot of it went back to the Declaration of Arbroath before it was written down. That tradition goes back so far back. It's actually written down in the Declaration of Arbroath. It talks about Princess Scotia coming out of Egypt along with the other tribes of Dan that were realising their own freedom again. Yeah, they were building pyramids, they were well fed, they were well catered for, they were fit, intelligent and healthy people. But they were told when they could build, when they could do this, when they could do that, their actual freedom was taken away. That freedom, that lust for freedom was taken by Princess Scotia way back in the Egyptian times when they came out of Egypt along with Moses. That was Moses's adopted sister. In fact, it's more of his sister adopted him as a little brother, really. But Scotia came through, and it's just written down in the Declaration of Arbroath as that oral tradition about the story of the Celts and the first Scottish tribes coming up through the Iberian Peninsula, which we now know as Spain, for 500 years, and then coming up through the Celtic nations of Britain, through Ireland, and eventually settling Alba, the entire peninsula. That needs to be told, that provenance, because that's what's behind the Declaration of Arbroath, and that's what fed into our Constitution, the claim of right. So don't forget that, and talk about that provenance that underpins the Declaration of Arbroath, and the provenance taken forth to pronounce what we already knew even back before the first millennium, before the birth of Christ. We knew what our sovereignty was through the oral tradition, and it was written down in 1320 in the claim of right. Many people will then come on to talk after me a little bit more about the detail of the claim of right, I'm sure, and sing about it too. But always talk about that provenance, because that provenance props up everything that we are fighting for today. Don't forget that. Enjoy the rest of the songs and speeches today.